Rick and Morty just made us experience ego death. Welcome back to Nerdist News, I'm Dan Casey, and today we're talking about the latest episode of Rick and Morty. After a drug and Hugh Jackman-addled premiere, the second episode of Season 7 gave us a heaping helping of buddy comedy and body horror with its body swap story gone awry. To paraphrase my colleague Michael Walsh, Rick and Morty uses absurdity as a Trojan horse to ruminate on philosophy and what it means to be alive, and that became abundantly clear after watching and rewatching the Jerrick Trap. We're gonna break it all down for you in just a moment, but in order to do so we have to spoil what happens in the latest Rick and Morty. So if you haven't seen it yet and you're worried about that sort of thing, leave now before it's too late.
Look at this pancake butt.
Stop! You're gonna make me fart!
Okay, let's get into it, shall we? It's a Rick and Jerry episode, everyone!
Jesus, Jerry, what the hell are you doing here?
What are you talking about? We agreed a boy's father should be present when he's learning to drive.
The Jerrick Trap is seemingly a body swap story at first glance, but with a bit of a twist. It's Freaky Friday meets The Parent Trap meets Face Off with a dash of body horror for good measure.
So we're swapping bodies?
No, that would be Freaky Friday, which is the ceiling of your grasp of consciousness.
But beneath that framework and the spectacle of this being a Rick and Jerry episode, we find a deep examination of the concept of ego and the illusion of self. Despite it being called Rick and Morty, Rick and Jerry are actually the perfect encapsulation of this show. Rick and Jerry as a duo are both brilliant and incredibly dumb at the same time, and that makes for a potent mixture. At the outset of the episode, Jerry asks for Rick's help with a rake situation, recovering a missing rake from their neighbor Gene. Why Jerry can't simply ask for it back himself is another matter entirely, but it leads to a debate about whether people are born smart and should check their brain privilege, or if they have to work just as hard as everybody else to achieve what they do. And honestly, that's what every shonen anime boils down to: hard work versus innate genius. Looking at you, Naruto. Using what looks like Doc Brown's mind-reading helmet from Back to the Future, Rick implants Jerry's consciousness in Rick's mind, and Rick's consciousness in Jerry's mind. And the subsequent shock of having their consciousnesses implanted into the other person is acute, nightmarish, and unbearable. In a matter of moments, both Rick and Jerry lie in crumpled heaps on the floor, and on the walls. It's a huge mess.
There goes my Thursday.
When Rick and Jerry die, they're rebuilt by the garage as strange amalgamations of each other. As writers Albro Lundy and James Siciliano revealed in the post-show interview, they refer to them from this point out as Rick Body and Jerry Body in the script, because they are technically new people.
Don't bother chiding until they're unshuffled. Neither one is Dad or Rick.
What begins as a struggle for identity as the two halves of their consciousness war with the other leads to a sort of ego death. Although their melded consciousnesses are working at cross purposes, they are more similar than they think. Rick and Jerry are both bonded by this deep-seated well of loneliness. It's a through line that runs across the entire series. Rick's loneliness stems from feelings of isolation caused by his ego-driven selfishness, his sense of superiority, and the trauma of losing his family and alienating his friends. It's perhaps best summarized by the Rick hologram in Season 4's The Old Man in the Seat.
Look at you sitting there, king on his throne of loneliness.
For Rick, it's a constant battle between gazing into the abyss of cosmic nihilism and feeling grounded by his deep and abiding love for the family he has. For Jerry, he is, by his own admission, largely friendless. Everybody in his life treats him like a doormat. He's a cowardly, feckless, and ultimately selfish person who wants to be better, but doesn't know how.
What?
This shared loneliness and alienation also reflects different perspectives on the absurdity of life and how we as humans grapple with the meaning of it. It calls to mind the dynamic between BoJack Horseman and Mr. Peanut Butter.
What is this? A crossover episode?
In both the case of Rick and Jerry and BoJack and Mr. Peanut Butter, these duos seem to be at odds at first glance. Their existential and nihilistic awareness of their lives reaches a similar conclusion, but does so by coming through an opposite lens. Characters like Rick and BoJack see life as meaningless and nothing we do matters in a negative inflection, calling them to action, while characters like Jerry and Mr. Peanut Butter offer a slightly more optimistic interpretation of that same sentiment. They see it more as a statement of relief than of resignation. Rick and BoJack seek answers and purpose, Jerry and Mr. Peanut Butter seek happiness and distraction.
The universe is a cruel, uncaring void. The key to being happy isn't to search for meaning, it's to just keep yourself busy with unimportant nonsense, and eventually you'll be dead.
Despite their shared propensity for loneliness and self-loathing, Rick and Jerry can't see past their sense of self to identify those same feelings in the other person, at least not until they see how their actions place Morty directly in harm's way after they piss off a mid-tier crime dork who now thinks he can kill God. During the post-show interview, series co-creator Dan Harmon brought up a concept in Buddhism that describes the core conflict of this episode. He said, all suffering stems from the illusion that we are different people. Those guys are getting a taste of getting past that illusion. They're not that different. It's a sentiment that also reminded me of the writings of Alan Watts and how the construction of ego can be othering, isolating, and can lead to strife, anger, and conflict. Now, for those who don't know, Alan Watts was an English philosopher whose writings were steeped in Buddhist and Taoist concepts, which are deeply applicable in light of Harmon's comments. Watts talked about the ego and our conception of consciousness in a way that feels particularly apt for this episode. In his lecture, The Myth of Myself, Watts said, "In Western civilization, most of us feel I, ego, myself, my source of consciousness, to be a center of awareness and action that resides in the middle of a bag of skin. And so we have what I've called the conception of ourselves as a skin-encapsulated ego." Also, in Watts' lecture, The Inevitable Ecstasy, he perfectly summarized how our sense of self is defined in most instances within the context of society. And we see that at play with both Rick and Jerry prior to their transformation. Watts said, "The image I have of myself is a caricature. It's arrived at through mainly my interaction with other people who tell me who I am in various ways, either directly or indirectly. And I play about with what their picture is of me, and they play something back to me, so we set up this conception." Watts described the ego as a social convention, one of which that we are unaware. It refracts and synthesizes data from the universe and signals from others into an image of ourselves. And seeing through the illusion of ego to achieve a sense of inner peace and a greater awareness can be a noble pursuit. I mean, just look at what it does for Rick Body and Jerry Body. Their happiness comes from divorcing themselves from the trap of ego-driven self-interest, and not just from putting hamburgers in dead guys' mouths.
So they just stick burgers in dead guys' mouths now?
In dead criminals' mouths.
And yet, as we see in this episode, ego and a sense of self have distinct and important purposes in our world. They ground us, they define our relationships, and help imbue us with an individuality that is frankly irreplaceable. When ego rules over us and runs amok, you get the loneliness, the anger, and the violence that permeates the first half of this story. When it's completely destroyed, you move beyond the hang-easy McConaughey platitudes into the detached, emotionless zero-sum horror of Jerrick. Evoking characters like Dr. Manhattan, Leto II from God Emperor of Dune, and Goro from Mortal Kombat, Jerrick is supposed to be this perfect being.
All the positive aspects of each perfectly melded together?
Yes, I am Jerrick.
Yet in merging together into one perfect collective being, they've divorced themselves from humanity. They've transcended society and the need to get caught up in the endless web of relationships that define us as humans. Jerrick's basically that Watchmen panel of Dr. Manhattan saying, "I'm tired of Earth, these people. I'm tired of being caught in the tangle of their lives." It's a harsh awakening for the Smith family in particular, who rightly called Jerrick out on their bullshit.
I thought when you came to rescue us, you learned to love us more than ever. You learned the opposite?
And to that, Jerrick claims that Burger and Fries learned to love each other, then sacrificed themselves out of love for you.
I am Jerrick, and I only need to love myself.
You can't actually be leaving, right?
This is ego death taken to its logical or maybe illogical conclusion, a being that tears the social contract asunder because it has no need for society or contracts. And while Jerrick does have that sweet sonic scream attack, they are cold, lifeless, and unapproachable. They retain none of the verve, vigor, and personality that made Rick and Jerry beloved to their family and to the audience. Thankfully though, Chekhov's rake is there to save the day.
You think a rake will change my mind?
In classic Sideshow Bob fashion, Jerrick steps on the rake, and it breaks their cosmic cool long enough for Rick and Jerry's egos to assert themselves once more.
Morty, we're still in here!
Specifically, they're saved by a fragment of Rick's ego, Memory Rick, who we last saw in Season 5's Rick-ternal friendship of the Spotless Mort. That was an episode where Rick traveled into Bird Person's consciousness to save his friend from dying. Memory Rick is this idealistic 30-year-old version of Rick from Bird Person's memories who sacrificed himself to save Rick and Bird Person so they could make their way back to the real world. However, Memory Rick did survive and lived on as a sentient memory inside Rick's head. And as Alan Watts wrote in The Wisdom of Insecurity, memory is a present trace of the past. And while one normally can't separate oneself from present thought and present experience, Memory Rick is a sentient being, and thus, he was able to help temporarily free Rick and Jerry from the oppressive transcendence of Jerricky. Now, unfortunately for Memory Rick, he's now stuck somewhere far worse, Jerry's head, which apparently is a place full of springs, gears, memory gene, and not much else.
Building more sculptures out of springs and gears?
F off, Memory Gene.
But all jokes aside, the significance of Memory Rick, a living embodiment of ego saving the day, should not be underestimated or lost on us. Rick and Jerry ultimately gained a new perspective from each other's opposing philosophical vantage points and came to appreciate the need for both in navigating life. While Rick and Jerry returned to this baseline of conflict they acknowledged earlier, we're left to understand that sense of self may be a social construct leading to emotional distress, but it's an important one, because it gives structure, definition, and texture to the tapestry of our lives, especially as they weave together with those of our friends and family. Because the alternative, following the path of Jerricky, may be tempting in the abstract, but not so much in practice.
Do you not hear the symphony of atoms dying in space?
No.
Anyway, folks, there you have it. That's everything you need to know about the latest episode of Rick and Morty. We'll be back next week with another breakdown for you and have even more pop culture deep dives over on Nerdist in the meantime.
Oof, I've been on that website.
And if you want to overthink what happened in the Season 7 premiere, guess what? We've got you covered with a rumination on coming-of-age tropes. For now, though, tell us, what did you think of this episode? Do you agree with our assessment? Did you spot anything that we missed?
Did this guy always have a hole, or is that a big reveal?
Let us know in the comments below, and for the latest and greatest in the world of pop culture, make sure you stay tuned to Nerdist.com.